Welcome to the C-Suite Sales and Marketing Perspectives podcast. I'm Steve McDonald, your host. And today we have a very special guest on, Jason Cimino. And Jason, you're a chief growth officer right now. Your background has been different than anyone that I've interviewed on this podcast. And we're up to almost 300 C-Suite executives. You actually started out as a journalist at the Wall Street Journal, like investigative reporting, and has led into a sales career. And now you're heading up as a chief growth officer. What we're going to talk about today, and it's going to be interesting for you to connect all those dots, but we're going to talk about how do you own revenue outcomes? And you think about this in very different ways that are very unique that I just loved when we were talking before. You also are an avid athletics fan, NBA fan. You played college hoops. That's fantastic. Go Knicks this year. I'm not from there, but I love watching them play. So what I'd love to do is, if you don't mind, maybe expand a little bit on your background and how you got to chief growth officer. And then we're going to dive right into the subject of owning revenue outcomes.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you, Steve. Thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited for the conversation today. So to set a little bit of context and background, so I actually was never a reporter for the Journal. So I'll sort of give you the journalism background and then how I got to the Journal, and then the winding road that got me here to Bond today. But, growing up, I always loved media. I always loved journalism. I always loved writing. I actually wasn't a huge reader, which is funny, but like a voracious consumer of news and of digital content, like around my teens and into my college years. And then, as you mentioned, I did go to Washington Lee University, where I was fortunate to be able to play basketball. And I did major in mass communication and journalism. I got a crash course in how to communicate, how to write, how to do that succinctly and briefly. And I still think back to some of the journalism classes I took with Professor DiMaria and others, where you don't bury the lead, right? You have to be able to structure things in a way where the most important information comes quick and fast and is thoughtful to the point. And when I try and communicate today with my teams or with other executives, I'm constantly using, some of these journalism lessons. My first job out of school, I actually did work for the Wall Street Journal, as you mentioned. It was more in the corporate strategy realm. And it was very interesting because I got to use that media side of my background and of the things that I was excited by. But then I learned pretty quickly in my career that business development was for me, because one of the first things I got to work on there was, how do we get the Journal, the digital version of the Journal, behind the paywall, into large B2B institutions? How do we sell them more access to the digital version of the Journal? So I worked on a couple of really interesting deals. The biggest one of note, if you think of a large coffee distributor and retailer, if you log onto their Wi-Fi, you can actually have access to the Journal behind the paywall. So any consumer anywhere can get access to that high quality information. But as a young kid coming out of school, I realized so I could sell the content and the information my company has to a large institution who can then provide that to their customers to create a better experience for their customers. And I think for years growing up, I had thought of sales as a bit of a dirty word, used car salesman, all movies, everything we've seen. But what I found really early in my career was, hey, you can actually make 1 + 1 = 11 and do something really interesting for your company, for your partners, for the folks you're selling to, and ultimately for consumers who I really cared about, because I cared about the Journal and I cared about journalism, and I still do. And then that led me into a variety of different roles within Dow Jones, which then led me at a certain point into a startup called Game Face Media, which was a really fun startup in the endurance sports space, where we were selling access to individuals' photographs at endurance events. So it was a media play, right? So again, my media background led to that. We used to call it the most compelling content in the world, a photo of an individual. Brand could sponsor and give to the individual. From there, that led to my time at RightPoint, because I had worked on a project where we were potentially going to build a mobile application, and we vetted the best mobile app firms in the world. We were going to go with those folks. We didn't end up building the app, but I ended up working at the company, which was pretty fascinating. And then I had a 10-year run at RightPoint, which then led me to where I am today at Bond as the chief growth officer. I've kind of done it all in the B2B agency world at this point. So I've led marketing teams, I've led new business teams, I've led existing customer and sort of client partner teams, as I call them, all of which sits under my remit today. And we're at a really interesting time in the ecosystem of where Bond is. And I was brought in to help take this amazing infrastructure. I call Bond the greatest hidden gem in all of North America from a professional services agency consultancy perspective on what we're trying to do and where we're taking our business next, helping lead our existing customers, our new business engine, and our marketing as well.
What a well-rounded background and a lot of different roles. And here's what I'd love to do. I'd love to start at the top of this kind of accountability. And you think about how you even redefine C-suite ownership, right? And it seems like they're accountable to the board. They have like the ultimate amount of ownership in the business, but I'd love to hear your perspective on that and redefining the C-suite ownership role.
Yeah, I think it's funny, right? Like the way I sort of think about these things is my job and my title was Chief Growth Officer. I have one singular focus, and that's growing our clients' business. And if I can grow our clients' businesses, every single client we work with, the business on the bond side will take care of itself, right? If we accomplish our objective, which is to do that for our clients. Now, to do that, the accountability starts with me and then sort of leads into our teams. But I really try to be in the work as much as I can. And I think the balance that every executive, especially in the modern era, has to balance is you can get so wrapped up in the minutia that it takes all of your time and you can't ever do the strategic thinking and you don't force yourself to think bigger and move the biggest rocks up the hill. But I would also argue that the executives who just spend their time moving rocks up the hill and don't actually understand their business, they don't actually understand what's happening on the ground. They're not actually listening to their teams or their people, or they're not challenging their priors and they're not, challenging their assumptions and the assumptions that their growth plans built on every single day. That's the gap and sort of who's successful, right? It really sits in the middle of being able to modulate yourself into the weeds to get an understanding, right? When the data tells you something that's different than what's actually happening, being able, again, to sort of have the blue collar mentality of rolling up your sleeves and being able to do any job in the company versus the ability to also think strategic. I think that's why we're in the seat that we are in, is to make sure you can do the trade-offs and find the right balance there. But personally, as I've sort of grown up in my career, I will not get far away from being able to do every job because I think it's really important that you understand what's actually happening. And again, some of that's listening to people, some of that's reading, some of that's consuming, some of that's talking to external partners, right? Third parties, but it's the amalgamation of all that information that you get and helps you make some of those more strategic decisions. So in my mind, I joke all the time, like it is much more of a blue collar style executive, and our team at Bond, we all pride ourselves as a leadership team about that. And I think that's one of the exciting parts about working for or with us as an organization is that we're all in it together. Often say, get the right team in the boat and make sure that, everyone's rowing at the same time, in the same direction.
So here's what I hear often is that we have way too much on our plates. And there's always that list of proactive things, right? That we're trying to get to desperately. If we could tick one of those off a week, we're like excited, right? And we just keep moving them and moving them to the next week or the next week. What you're talking about makes complete sense, right? I talk to other C-suite executives that say, I have to spend more time close to the customer. If I'm not actually talking to the customer, you're the chief growth officer, right? Like you said, expanding the customer relationships, right? That's a whole nother area that you could devote time to. How do you prioritize? And then, because at the end of the day, to make those decisions is the decision not to do something else, right? Because we can't do it all. So I would love to just kind of hear a little bit about how you rationalize or how you prioritize your time for the things that you think are the most important.
Yeah. It's a good question. I know in some of our prep, we talked a little bit about some of the sports background, right? And I did play hoops in college and still love it and still follow it and still am fascinated with it. And I do have a little bit of a mental model, like, the book Moneyball stands out as one of my favorite books of all time. So as I think about investments and sort of internal things and people and new opportunities and things we go after, I do try to apply, that sort of sports analytics, Moneyball angle to the work that we do every day from a personal perspective and sort of what's my personal framework on that. I think number one is alignment across your executive team, across your board on what you're after, right? So we have really clear alignment of what we're headed into our fiscal year in April, of what we're after for next year. Beyond that, we have our 3-year roadmap and our plan for 3 years. Beyond that, we've been thinking a little bit longer term and longer horizon. Nowadays, I think anything outside of 3 years, the pace that things move is that it's a fool's errand, but it's really hard to predict outside of that. So if we have agreement on that as a team, which we do, and we're in lockstep and we're all rowing against that, then the next thing we start to do is say, okay, if these things are true, or if I need to make them true, how do I then do that? And what are the bets I'm going to make against that? Some of it's funny, right? Like on the sales side, I put myself back into the individual contributor 2016, 2017 timeframe in my mindset. And it was go hit a quota, right? Like you have a $5 million quota or a $6 million quota. And what is your revenue walk to get to that quota? And, I used to do this every month where I would be thinking about, okay, has my sales math changed? Do I have to have more conversations or less or grow the pipeline? When I wasn't a more individual contributor, I was never a volume based. Like that was not my style. I actually didn't carry a huge pipeline. It was a little bit smaller, but I prided myself on being able to close at a higher percentage than, some of the reps that I had worked with or seen in the market. So I tell you all this to say, right? Like if you have your assumptions and you have your plan and you're constantly working your plan, then you can constantly be adjusting and evaluating, are the bets we are making the right bets? Is there a perfect formula? No. Like, do I feel like I have this nail all of the time? No. And I tell the teams this all the time, right? Like we get into a lot of analysis paralysis where you're now taking a month to make a decision where your two paths, one might have you 3 to 5 percentage points better if you make that decision. But if you wait a month, that gain that you might have gotten is probably lost, right? So it's being able to say, okay, here are the assumptions we're working under. We have the alignment we need to. Here's the bets we're going to make. And here's metrics we're going to track to change course if we need to. And if I can do that and I can make, the right 3 to 5 decisions a week, that's how I know I'm in a good groove and sort of prioritizing well. I find that if I'm making 50 decisions a week or, a number of a giant magnitude, I'm probably too far in the weeds. I'm not empowering the team enough. And then my prioritization work is definitely off. So I know it's not like very concrete, but I think the sort of numbers and the advice I'd give other people is get yourself to a place where you understand like the most important decisions and you have to move week over week, which then bleeds to day by day, right? And all of it's with that sort of broader alignment that if you don't have as a leadership team, you should be fighting every day as an executive to get to. I'm lucky we're actually like, we have that big picture alignment. So a lot of my work then is a little bit more downstream. Not to say we're not challenging those assumptions every day as a leadership team and all that stuff, but it gets a little bit easier when you feel like you're in a good operating cadence at the executive team level.
Really interesting. You bookended that answer with alignment. And one of the things that we do in this podcast is we ask every C-suite executive that comes on the very same question. And you and I talked about this on our last call. What do you see as the 2 greatest challenges for creating long-term sustainable growth? The number one challenge by far, 72% of C-suite executives said this was their number one challenge, internal alignment. And what's fascinating is that of the top 10 challenges, 9 out of the 10 were 100% internal, or they were hybrid, where the very first step to address the challenge was an internal step. So the big takeaway on all of this is that, and I think you just nailed it on the head when you talked about, we're lucky. You said, we're lucky. We're internally aligned. That is not an easy place to get. That's why it's the number one challenge across all B2B C-suite executives. So I would just love to ask, because you guys have achieved something that a lot of companies haven't. Like, how did you get that alignment? Knowing that it's very, very difficult, that you said, because of that alignment, I now know downstream in my department what my mandate is, what I need to be doing. It trickles down and affects everyone in the organization. So how would you recommend to the listeners here to get internal alignment amongst the C-suite that then trickles through the organization?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think if I had all of the answers, I think I would be, way more successful than I even am. But I would say, I think a lot of it does start with, and this is a weird way to say it, but it starts with like getting uncomfortable a little bit and driving some of the tension in those leadership and alignment sessions. I think we all want to be extremely collegial, right? With the people we work with and that we're closest with. Like I spend more time with a lot of my coworkers than I do with my wife, right? And, from a day-to-day perspective, tension doesn't always feel great, but tension is really good in business and it's really healthy, right? So working through big issues. Now, I would say one area where we're getting better every day at Bond is like we get to an agreement on a decision. How fast can you then turn around that decision and execute it? Like, how do you actually measure that? So that's an area where I think we're taking a big step because even if you have alignment, if you're not measuring to it, that's where the alignment can start to fall apart. So I would advise folks to push really hard in those leadership and executive conversations. Like, don't leave things unsaid as a group, because if you're thinking it and it's unsaid in your belly, you can bet it's unsaid in someone else in the leadership team's belly. I also tell my group that all the time, right? In either the existing business or the marketing team, or like, if you have something and you don't agree, like say it out loud. I don't even want to use the word like safe space because I don't think that's the right term for this, right? I want a space where there's disagreement and, tension and challenging each other's ideas. Where I want the safety to come is that when we make a decision, we're going to agree, we're going to get aligned, and then we're going to operate against that decision and those assumptions that we've agreed on. So I think what I would say the advice for folks is force those conversations and don't sit back. And if you're feeling it, one of your other executive partners is likely. I joke all the time. I think I thought I had everything figured out probably until around the pandemic. And then, March of 2020, I realized, we're all going to be making it up from here on out. No one's gone through this before in the business world, right? And it was a really good life lesson for me that even when you think, oh, I've done this before, the conditions are completely different today than when you did it 3 years ago, than when you did it a month ago, right? Like the world is just changing so fast nowadays, the velocity and the pace at which things are moving. I tell you that to ultimately say, like, we're all figuring it out and everyone should feel comfortable and confident that you're figuring it out as you go and articulating that to your colleagues. And if that environment is not created, really push for how you create it and also look for, for leaders that you want to work for that provide that. I'm really lucky that we do have that. But then I'm trying every day and I ask my team to hold me accountable to this, like make sure I'm fostering that same alignment and, disagree and commit in our individual teams, right? Like once it breaks down, because I think to get to the big picture vision, like I told you, it's a work back plan, right? Under a bunch of assumptions that can be constantly changing. So making sure teams are working against those in the same way the leadership group is really paramount.
It's interesting. Like one of the things I'm going to paraphrase it in there is you said that you've got to keep innovating. You got to keep figuring it out. The moment we think we have the playbook for how it's supposed to be done, I literally just got done last week recording a podcast with a 4-time B2B CRO. And he said, Steve, there are things I'm doing now that I wasn't doing 3 months ago. He goes, things are changing that fast. So anybody that thinks that they have it, they got it all figured out. The world's changing on us. The market's changing. Our ICP is changing. Our company is changing. And if we don't embrace that change, I think that's a big part of what I'm taking away from what you're saying here is, right, is that there is going to be that dynamic. There's going to be change. There's going to be innovation. But how we quickly align on it and then act on it is really, really important. There was a 4-time B2B CMO that came on and she said, Steve, execution is where all good strategy goes to die, right? So we can talk about it, we can align on it, but if we don't have a plan to act on it and be accountable and come back together on it, it doesn't matter. The decisions we made do not matter, right? Now, you introduced in our last conversation another level, another dynamic in all of this. And you said, Steve, I've changed the way that I hire. So I hire for agency now. Tell us what you meant by that and why you made that change.
I think the last couple sentences you just laid out are why I've really shifted my mindset on this, right? So a prior assumption was if you have done it before, you can likely do it again, right? And if you sort of have repeatable steps and processes, specifically for hiring and sales, right? Like there is a science to sales. I probably err a little bit more to the middle on the science art spectrum than other sales leaders do. But the reason I've sort of really shifted in what I'm looking for, and I keep coming back to that word agency over the last couple of months, is to get to the outcomes that we all collectively want as leaders in our business. The individuals who are driving the execution and who are driving the strategy forward need to have agency in the outcome, right? Because there will be reasons to get blocked every single day, multiple times a day, especially in the professional services realm where this is not a widget based environment, right? We are dealing with human beings who are having challenges and struggles. And, there are different things in a professional services business that you might get in a SaaS business. And so the agency side of things is when you have your biggest challenge to go get a deal done, to go produce a webinar on the marketing side, to get alignment between two leaders on the content you're going to produce in that webinar, to get two executives who are competing in a client's organization to get lined up and make a decision for you, right? Like you have to feel as though you have agency in that outcome and then do everything you can to make that thing happen on our organization's behalf, right? Whether that's the internal work and working the internal machine or the external work. But I have found the people who are in the river, letting the river take them where the river goes versus the people who are saying, nope, I want the river to go that way and I'm going to build a dam to get it that way. That's sort of the dichotomy that I see, right? Like the agency element of that is, you know what? No, the river's going the wrong direction. I'm going to build a dam and get it to another place because building a dam might not be in your job description, right? Like, but it might be description of getting the outcome that we want. And the people that I have found are most successful in B2B growth roles or marketing roles are people who fundamentally believe that they have agency and can control the outcome. Again, I'm not a lunatic. I understand there's circumstances beyond all of our controls, but ultimately you should be doing everything you can that's within your power of bond to help the organization get to the ultimate outcomes. And then obviously if you do that on your client's behalf as well, that's how you create trusted relationships and the client feels like you can do things for them and you can break down walls and barriers that they haven't had other partners be able to do, right? Which in my mind, that all comes back to agency. The question is, how do you assess for that? I think from athletics perspective, right? I'm like, I love that as a profile. I love that as a background. I love in interviews being like, oh, okay, so you were successful there. Well, what were the 3 challenges that you had to blow through to do that? Oh, you were successful in that thing. Well, was it cookie cutter or was it completely out of the box? Like, did you do that 50 times or was that unique? And really trying to understand through, difficult interview questions and a little bit more getting into the weeds of like, did you actually go create this? Was it handed to you? What challenges did you have to get through? Because I will say in the modern business era, like you touch on, right? This stuff's harder than ever. Growth is increasingly difficult for our clients as much as it is for us. So that agency is super important.
And this is decades old information. So I don't know if this is a mantra inside of Nike, but like with your athletics background, they used to call what you're saying here the corporate athlete. You didn't have to have the exact right background on your resume, but if you were somebody that could get in and figure it out and make it happen, that's who they wanted in their organization. And we do every single day. Every single day, we run into a roadblock, a challenge, something that we didn't see coming, something that we've got to get around. And our ability to do that, I'm just going to tell you right now, you have personally changed the way that I'm looking at talent. And because it's true, it's true. It's the reason why people stay on the team or they leave ultimately. And churn in our team and our companies is so corrosive, right? For getting that growth that we need. The last thing that your clients want is your team changing over on them, right? Absolutely. So I got to tell you, this has been fascinating. You talked about something else. So I'm going to take a right turn because I want to get in these new lanes of thinking that you have. You called it demand creation mastery. And explain what that is and why it's important if you could.
Yeah. So I think if I pile onto the last conversation around agency, I mean, I'm looking for in our organization right now, as we do have aggressive growth plans, people that are very growth minded and they want to grow and to do those things, right, to help grow our clients' portfolio. I think no one wants to be sold to anymore. Like, how many times does your phone ring from a random number? You're not going to answer it right now. Like, I think the days of pick up the phone 100 times and call a bunch of people, this is sort of the moving away from the science of sales into a little bit more of the art. I think those days are gone. I think, modern growth and demand generation, and I think it comes from looking through the entire ecosystem and like really starting to solve problems before clients see them, and, reaching out to them based on valuable information and intelligence. Like, I don't think, I shouldn't say, it's very rare that even myself, like when I'm being sold to, I pick up the phone or I respond to an email if there's not a really valuable, like, hey, here's 3 things I know about your business or your company, your team, or the problem you're trying to solve. And, I won't 5 or 10 minutes of your time to talk that out. Or, using introductions. Like, I had a candidate come in for a role recently through a third party partner. They asked the partner to reach out to me on their behalf. And I think really highly of that partner. So when he did that, I was like, yes, of course. And again, some of this is really basic, old school relationship building from a demand gen perspective. But for me, it comes down to really thinking about the ecosystem of the problem that the client's trying to solve. And then really like systematically working your way through, how do we provide valuable information to getting to that outcome that can start a conversation? And once you get a conversation going, you have to do all of the stuff, all the table stakes prerequisites. You have to be well researched, you have to be well read. You have to, have probably 3 or 4 conversations with other people in that organization before you meet the person that you got the meeting with, right? Like, and all of that sort of valuable prep work, that's how you start to generate demand. And if you do that constantly, conversation, you got other conversations and begat other interesting people that you meet, and it becomes somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Like, and this is not busy work to be busy, right? But the best salespeople, and this is where I tend to use a lot of my journalism background when I'm doing this work myself, is that doesn't pass my smell test. I'm not going to like take that for a grain of salt, or I'm going to go deeper on that topic because I'm not sure I trust it. Or, you know what? I've now heard this 2 or 3 times from 2 different people. Where there's smoke, there's fire. I'm going to keep going down this path. So that's what I think of like demand generation mastery. It's really the ability to have a vast amount of conversation, process that information, and use it to take what we can provide, because we do feel as though we are well positioned in the market. We have valuable services offerings, right? And if we can get in and showcase that to our clients, there's a lot of work for us and a lot of growth ahead of us, which is why we feel so confident in sort of where we are in the market. But to do that, it requires a whole bunch of work that has to happen all the time. I joke all the time, it's like being in shape, right? Like, you can't, as soon as you get out of shape, it's way harder to get back in it. As soon as you get out of, really this mindset of like consistent conversations and sort of thinking through your sales math, right? Like, it's really hard to get back on that. So long-winded way of saying like demand generation mastery for me comes down to, can you have the right conversations and then use those conversations to provide value to their clients that need it most, right? And need the most help from a services org like us.
I actually love it. It goes back in my mind to what we were talking about earlier, is that there is no playbook. We have to constantly innovate. And the thing that I took away from there is we have to get into those right conversations. If we can get into those right conversations and we feel good about the trust and the value that we can provide, then we'll make the most out of it. Getting into those conversations is the hard part. And it's getting harder and harder. The B2B buyer today, the self-service, journey, they're waiting longer and longer and longer to want to even talk to us. And people have more and more on their plate, right? Teams aren't being increased, they're being decreased. So people are spending more time trying to get less time getting more done. So for us to carve out space in their time and get a piece of that valuable time, we got to really think through that. Right. And that's what I took away from your demand mastery, is that we have to treat that conversation with something with such respect that we have to earn the right for that conversation. We're not owed that conversation at all.
Nope. And it's fine too, because we've been working on our new go to market. And I think We and a lot of agencies and consultancies are guilty of this, right? They're like, hey, we actually don't want to pitch ourselves. We want to hear what the problems are, and then we'll help you solve your problems. And I say to our team all the time, right? Like, that is the goal of the conversation, is to listen. But you also have to earn the right to ask, hey, what is your biggest problem? What is keeping you up at night? And you earn that right by the research you do and by everything we talked about in that sort of last little segment there. And I push our groups on that all the time. Like, I would love to get on the phone with some of our CMO clients or prospects and just say, what's the biggest thing keeping you up at night? I can solve that. But I genuinely don't feel like I have the right to do that without credentializing us and the value we can bring based on our external knowledge so far, right? And I often say to folks, hey, look, we have a 50 to 60% of the way there baked perspective. We're going to have this conversation. We're going to give you some of that intelligence. We expect you to say, hey, you're wrong in these 2 or 3 areas, but you're right in these 3 or 4, lean into those a little bit further. And the next conversation will get you from 50 or 60% of the way, but you help us bake the cake to get to 70 or 80, right? But that first tranche of work, you have to do that, right? In a modern, sales growth role or trajectory. And it's incumbent upon you. And I don't always think that was the case. I think the best were always doing it that way, but I think you could have gotten away with it, maybe 5, 7 years ago, not having done that nowadays. And you have no excuse to, right? With the tools we have at our disposal to do research better, to understand things faster. The tools our clients have, we have too, right? To understand these things. So I think that's really important, is just table stakes to being successful in any role, in any growth or marketing org.
Here's what I know. We've got a minimum another half an hour podcast we got to keep going on. Right? We didn't even get to half the stuff we wanted to talk about today. It's so fascinating. And the mission of this whole podcast is just to bring different perspectives from different C-suite executives from around the world that are solving the problem of their biggest challenges for growth in their business. We're all in a B2B, ABM, go-to-market motion. And if we can help each other and bring in different insights and perspectives like you did today, that's the rising tide that lifts all boats. And you were amazing. Thank you, Jason, so much for coming on today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me. I am very, very excited to have it released and get feedback in the market, and also to help everyone I can. To your point, Steve, I loved your term too, the corporate athletics, corporate athletes. I'm happy to help and support and grow other businesses. I think it's fun. It's why I like going to work. I like solving problems, and I'm happy to do it with the audience or any folks that, reach out to you. So thank you very, very much for having me. I appreciate it. Enjoyed our time together.